Hey everyone, welcome to another week of the JOANNA WHALEY podcast. Before we get started, if you are an LGBTQ person or an ally or a parent of a queer kiddo and you need support, you need spiritual support, you can go to patreon.com/JOANNA WHALEY, and I have free options. We have very, very cheap options for me to kind of be in your corner and be a pastoral presence in your life. That's patreon.com/JOANNA WHALEY. You can also go to joannawhaley.com/support. I host support groups and all other things. If you're somebody who doesn't want to be a member, but you want to support the work I do, you can go to joannawhaley.com/donate. That's joannawhaley.com/donate. Today, we're touching on a really tense topic. We're going to be talking about the conflict in the Middle East between Gaza, Israel, and all of that comes with the end times prophecies. Let's go. We're going to have a good time today. Here we go.
Alive and I'm thriving. No fear. There's no need for hiding. I'm not what they told me.
Alrighty, friends. Buckle up for another week of my podcast. You know, what I'm going to talk about today has been something that I've honestly been kind of avoiding for a while. It's a topic that I've just been kind of trying to be silent about, not say much about, and honestly because I don't have much of an opinion on the actual conflict and the things that are going on. If you're just joining us, today we're talking about the end. We're talking about end times. And we're specifically talking about what's going on right now with Israel and Gaza and the whole gigantic mess that's going on in the Middle East. But I want to talk about it today from a queer theological viewpoint. Yep, it's a very unique viewpoint. But if you're like me, I am an LGBTQ person, and I'm also a person that holds spirituality. I was an evangelical pastor for 20 years of my life, and I experienced the intense over-spiritualization of all things politics, of all things war, of all things specifically Israel, Middle East conflict. And it all wrapped into this idea of what was called rapture culture in the evangelical church. Just me? No, I know it's not just me. But I lived in this space as a young pastor who, when I was hired as a pastor at the age of 18, I was very impressionable. I knew very little about theology. All I knew going into being a pastor was how to make cool lights happen in my megachurch and how to make the sound system sound really cool. That's all I knew when I started off as a pastor. So all of the theological ideas were things that I had to learn on the fly. And now that I am in seminary, I'm so thankful to have educational training when it comes to theology. Because what I did as a young pastor is I really pushed some very harmful and absolutely made up theology when it comes to rapture, when it comes to the mark of the beast, when it comes to the blood moons and all these things. And honestly, a lot of this theology started to step into conspiracy theory, which was almost the topic of today's podcast, but I really wanted to step into this topic that I've really been avoiding for a long time. If you're just joining me, if you're watching live this podcast, I will be taking calls. I'll be asking questions. Ask your questions. We put in, for those who listen to the show and maybe you didn't catch the live this week, we've instilled some very serious moderation tools this week to make our spaces safer. So if you're somebody who listens to the show after the fact because you don't want to see the trolls and the homophobes and the transphobes in our lives, we have a moderator that's pushing them out. Cecilia asks, what denomination can I ask? I currently attend the United Methodist Church is where my home church is, but I visit all kinds of different churches within the broader spectrum of progressive Christianity. But, I wanted to bring this up because, end times theology, people saying the end is near, it's here. God, there's all these crazy things going on in the world. But I'm here to tell you that, end times theology should never target marginalized people. Because a lot of times, end times theology absolutely targets marginalized people. And one of the reasons and how that is created is when conflicts begin to raise in the world that maybe sniff a little bit of what you think you learned in church about the rapture and end times, this false sense and this unnecessary urgency begins to brew in people who have good intentions of trying to save the world. But how that turns and how that really starts to interact with the real world is you start to jump on live feeds. You start to jump on people's videos and you start to try to preach at them and try to tell them to repent and tell them that that they're making a mistake. They're going to hell. But we can't hear. Those of us in marginalized communities, in the queer communities, we can't hear your love through your false sense of urgency. So, I want to play a clip for you, and then I want to open up for questions. If you have questions, feel free to join. Hit the request to join button if you are on TikTok. I'd be so happy to get you a part of the conversation here. If you're on Facebook, shoot me a comment there. I'd be really, really happy to get you involved as well. I want to play you a clip from a TikTok creator that I have a lot of clips from him today, but I think he's got a lot to say to us. His name is Dan McClellan. Dan McClellan is a biblical scholar and more of a progressive biblical scholar, and I really love a lot of Dan's content. And so I'm going to play you a quick clip from Dan, and we'll talk about it on the other side of this. And Dan gave me permission to use all of his stuff today. Let's take a listen.
This is your regular reminder that the book of Revelation is not a prophecy about today. And the book of Revelation is a piece of late 1st century CE apocalyptic literature. And its author used fantastical and bizarre and sometimes grotesque imagery in order to capture the attention of their target audience and evoke an emotional response, and also encode the events that were going on around them in order to serve their rhetorical goals, which were primarily aimed at exhorting late 1st century CE followers of Jesus to faithfulness to their community, as well as to bring them comfort in the face of persecution at the hands of the Roman Empire, whether real or perceived. And one of the ways it did this was to present this kind of revenge fantasy where we peel back the fabric of reality to show that God is the one who's really in control, and they're going to come brutalize the enemies of the followers of Jesus. It is entirely about the late 1st century CE, and it does not prophesy anything beyond the late 1st century CE. So when people today try to read this, that, or the other person or event into the text in order to try to prognosticate the future, that's just their own creativity. But none of it has anything to do with what was intended by the author. And even early Christians interpreted it in a lot of different ways, or just rejected its authenticity. It really didn't become popular until the 4th century CE, when Athanasius of Alexandria decided that it was rhetorically useful for trying to structure power within the Christian church to serve his own interests. And unfortunately, its ultimate inclusion in the canon has resulted in an awful lot of trauma, an awful lot of anxiety, and an awful lot of false prophecies about why things that are happening today are happening today. The author had no special insight. They were talking about their own day. And when people try to find the events that are going on around them within this text written about the events going on at the end of the 1st century CE, they're just making that all up.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, a lot of people are just making this stuff up. And none is more evident to me than prophecy that was made up than the rapture. And if you're like me, you grew up in rapture culture. And when I was a young, struggling pastor who wrestled with my gender, I just prayed to God that the rapture wouldn't happen when I was trying on these clothes that I bought online, these girls' clothes that I bought online, right? I was like, oh my gosh, if I'm caught by God in that moment, the trumpet sounds, I'm done for, right? And that was really a very traumatizing, and it was ongoing like background noise. But in 1827 and like in the 1830s, the first time that this idea ever showed up was then in the 1830s. John Nelson Darby was reading in 1 Thessalonians 17 and began to share this idea and this concept of what he believed was the rapture, and he began to create this thing. So rapture theology has never been celebrated or believed by Christianity historically until 1827. Okay, so this is a newer idea, but we have this use of Revelation. We have the use of the book of Revelation, which we just heard from Dan, was not intended for this purpose. And so I remember that preaching of saying, well, if you're gay, you better not ABC, because if Jesus comes back in that moment, boy, are you in trouble. You know, it was all this idea that rapture culture put so much fear in us about what we were going to do alone at night on our own. What are your thoughts, friends? I'd love to hear from you. Shoot a comment if you're watching live. If you're watching live at any of my channels, I'd love to hear from you. But we taught people who believed in this idea of rapture culture, and it's just it's so damaging because it's taught with such authority, and it's taught out of a place of privilege. I'm going to play you another clip from Dan, and this clip really sums up what I want to drive at on the show today. It talks about the book of Revelation and privilege. Let's take a listen.
The book of Revelation was written to bring comfort to first century followers of Jesus and exhort them to faithfulness in the face of persecution. It is not a prophecy about today, and it can cause significant harm when we misunderstand it as a prophecy about today. And the book of Revelation makes use of first century apocalyptic themes and imagery in order to comfort followers of Jesus that God was working behind the scenes and would ultimately bring them victory, help them overcome their enemy, the much larger and oppressive Roman Empire. It also exhorts followers of Jesus to faithfulness in the face of persecution from that larger oppressive Roman Empire. It is not a prophecy about today, but when we misunderstand it as such, it requires us to find a place for ourselves in the narrative. Now, in that narrative, followers of Jesus were minoritized, marginalized, and oppressed groups, and they were under the boot of the much larger Roman Empire. Shortly after the book of Revelation was written, Christianity took over the Roman Empire, and many Christians ever since have lived in social and political circumstances where they exercised outsized influence and where they were on the privileged end of systemic power asymmetries. And that's particularly true of the United States today. But a part of finding ourselves in the narrative, understanding today as the fulfillment of the prophecies of the book of Revelation, requires that we find someone for the role of the larger oppressive empire that represents Satan. It requires that we find an oppressor for ourselves, which means we have to go out in search of somebody who is the social and the political other, whom we can cast as the demonized, satanic enemy of God. And far too often that means groups like Iran and Russia and China, or the Palestinians, including immigrants to the United States from those areas, including members of the LGBTQ plus community, including people who are trying to use new technology, including all kinds of different groups, many of whom are on the losing end of the systemic power asymmetries that so many Christians benefit from. So when you see people in positions of privilege and power trying to identify other groups as God's enemy, as the tools of Satan, as demonic forces, keep in mind what kind of damage that can cause just because we misunderstand what this book is about. And understanding it as a prophecy about today requires that we find someone to be the enemy.
And what a telling thing that we've been seeing now, right? I mean, you see, if you're watching the show live at Joanna Whaley Music on TikTok or on Facebook, on the TikTok version, you're seeing these flags. You're seeing the Gaza flag and the Israeli flag. And here in America, the United States is kind of globally the holdout for who is holding end times theology. And one of the reasons that we're that holdout is because we've really bought this idea of binary thought in America. And I mean, that's especially true in our debates about gender and who you can love and who you can't love. And these things have become very spiritual because we've so politicized our spirituality. You see, and people ask me like, well, it's in the Bible, it's in the Bible, it's in the Bible. Well, in 1909, the Schofield Reference Bible was the first Bible that ever actually referenced the 1830s idea of the rapture. This idea of dispensationalism, that God's relationship changes with us from time to time, right? But Schofield, for the first time, put in a study Bible this idea of rapture, of end times, and started to pull out of Revelation what hadn't been seen or talked about before by any scholars of the Bible. And you'll see lots of references to 1 Thessalonians 4, Malachi, Revelation, Matthew, Acts, First and 2 Thessalonians. But what we need to understand is that in America, and I love how Dan said it in his clip, and I know I'm playing a lot of clips today, but Dan said it in the clip, that especially in America, we feel like we have to have an enemy. And we feel like we have to have our own side. And this really is pushed even further by the religious among us because of the theology of good and evil, this or that, male or female. What we've done is we've removed nuance in our spirituality. When we say the Bible is clear, we remove the nuance of Scripture. We remove all creativity of God and require God to be in a set checkbox interaction with us. So, many people who are Bible literalists will look at the Bible and say, well, you have to read this. It says it right here in the book, But really, a lot of this comes from footnotes in study Bibles and not actual backed up Christian theology. And so, Tim Lee, I think is LaHaye, came out with the Left Behind series, and people honestly drew their doctrine from this fictional story. Now, this is a big setup here, right? This is a huge setup for what is my point tonight. My point tonight is that it's really easy to point someone out as an enemy when you had a binary framework for your theology. It's easy to look at a trans person who you've been told by all your pastors in all of your Bible studies to look at a trans person and say that person is evil. It's really easy to do that, and it gets even easier when you have a false sense of urgency created by BS end times theology. And what this begins to do is give people license to act urgently. It gives people license to treat LGBTQ people like trash because of holding this theology. And a lot of people will share their theology in a convincing way. Online, on TikTok, on Facebook, on Instagram, there's no shortage of people who get on with beautiful music behind them and share things that sound true, but are really a creative use of the Bible. What are your thoughts, friends? I know today, if you're just joining us for the first time, for those of my audio listeners, you heard me say this a couple times, we instilled some really strict moderation tools to keep our lives safer. And yeah, that has definitely, it's gonna drive down engagement with the live audience, but that's okay. We still have a very large audience that listens outside of live. But I want to hear your thoughts. If you're here, let me hear from you. Is end times prophecy and theology, is it benefiting the privileged? Is it putting the marginalized down in order to earn heaven and get there before everyone else? What is it doing? Because that's what I see. I was just saying, there's a lot of people that will share things that sound very convincing. And there's a creator that I like named Josh Benson. He's definitely probably a little more on the, from what I can gather, on the evangelical end of things, but I like his content because he calls a lot of folks out. And I'm going to play a clip from Josh Benson, and let's take a listen to it right here.
This solar eclipse happening next month could fulfill a 2,000-year-old Bible prophecy.
I am so over the thumbnail clickbait Christians on social media that provide zero value to the Christian community. I am convinced that Nick has a new end times prophecy or just video where he twists scripture around like once a week. And he's already blocked me on everything, so I'm convinced that he doesn't want to have any discourse about how misleading he's being. And as a Christian, these videos are so frustrating because they make us look like the people on Parks and Rec that followed Zorp the Lizard God.
Zorp the Lizard God. It's so true. And this was one of the things that was a red flag for me when I was an evangelical pastor. I was watching many people who I shared a faith with falling for, believing in really wild stuff, right? And when you start to think about some of these ideas of what does it mean when you're saying rapture culture, right? Like, what are you saying? What does that mean? Like, they'll be like, okay, well, like, what is it? You know, when you start to actually unpack some of it, it's like, that's like real crazy, right? Like, can we all agree that's a little bit out there? Like, you got pre-trib, post-trib, mid-trib, post-millennial, premillennial, amillennial. You have all these different ideas, you know, and the tribulation meaning like 7 years of tribulation. Like, there's going to be a lot of like, you know, there's going to be a lot of war and all these things going on in the world. And then you have the millennials, like 1,000 years of Jesus's peace on earth and all this stuff. But what this all does is it starts to create a culture of saying, if you don't look like me as a Christian, if you're LGBTQ, if you don't love like I love, if you don't dress how I dress, you are in danger. You get in this panic mode. And I remember that urgency. Does anybody remember the song? There's a Christian artist I used to love named Leland, and he used to have this song, I think it's called like Emergency or something like that. It's like, this is an emergency. And I remember that picture, like, it's an emergency. We have to preach the gospel to all these lost people. And when it came to LGBTQ people being in my church, the urgency was high because they were, quote, big air quotes for my audio audience that can't see me, they were living and choosing sin. And they were choosing a lifestyle that was going to send them to hell. I remember the intensity, and it was all ushered in by believing that end times were upon us. Even back when I was a young pastor, like 2005, when I first started becoming a pastor, people were like, oh my gosh, did you see like all this war in Egypt or all this war in the Middle East? The end is near. And then they would like say there's a full moon. They would like talk about these moons and all these things like, the end is near, all this stuff. And it's just like, ugh, I'm just like over it. Right? Like it, as Josh Benson, the TikToker said, I'm like over that, because what it's doing is it's putting a false urgency in Christians, and it's making them lash out and be really harsh with queer people. And if you're new to my content, that's who I advocate for. I'm an LGBTQ Christian. And one of the issues is that we have a false sense of urgency within the Christian church that thinks that the end is upon us, so we have to speak harshly towards people. We have to tell them how they are supposed to be. We have to call them all sorts of names, because that has now been an example for us. It's been an example politically for us, is calling each other names. But that somehow is because now think of it. When there's an emergency, right? You kind of throw protocol out the door and you just like, you run. You move fast. You get the hell out of there, right? Like if my house is on fire, I'm not like trying to find my keys and like lock the door on my way out. I'm like, no, get the kids and get out, right? And that's what's happened when we adopt these ideas that are really just false. They're false theologies. What we begin to do is we start to throw, instead of grabbing the keys, instead of taking care to love our neighbor, we start to lash out at them. And we start to call them names. And we start to think that our truth, speaking truth, we start to believe that homophobia is love. We start to believe that transphobia is love. We start to believe that if we say how somebody was created biologically and tell them they have to be that, then what we begin to do is we start to get into an emergency mode. And there's a lot of things that get burned, and there's a fallout from that. And this is one of the reasons, as that creator said, Josh Benson, a lot of Christianity looks like the people from Parks and Rec who are worshiping Thorpe. It just looks ridiculous. It just looks ridiculous. I said, I didn't want to talk about this topic today, because honestly, I've gotten threats. Direct threats from people, because I don't talk about this issue. And I'm like, I don't even have that many followers online. But I told myself, if I'm going to talk about this, I'm not going to take a side. I'm not going to take a stance. But what I'm going to say is that if your end times theology is against marginalized people, and it's creating false urgency, and you're treating marginalized people like crap, your theology is trash. And you have to absolutely see the humanity in someone else. We're going to go to a quick commercial. On the other side of our short commercial break, I'm going to dive into a little bit more on this topic and get into some topics of what's actually going on over there and how can we look at it from a progressive Christian lens, or just from a queer lens in general, and how can we interact with it. We'll be right back after this quick commercial break.
There's no